So you guys know that Europe is in serious trouble, right? It's not like the kinds of crises that we usually cover on this channel, the issues of civil war or state collapse or other various maladies that we cover more normally. It's more of a slow motion thing. There was a financial crisis back in 2008. Before that, Europe looked like a region that was filled with potential, still going forward on the immense potential and impressiveness of its sort of reunification of Germany and then unification and expansion of the EU project itself. Most of the 2000s looked pretty great. And then it all came to a screeching halt in 2008. And honestly, the 17 years since, the almost 2 decades since, it's been a story of just not quite getting it together. And the bright spots that you have to look at aren't really that bright. The United States recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. It's not clear that Europe ever did. There are a lot of reasons for this, but I think most fundamentally it's a question of unity. It's the EU put together this very large group of people. I think the population altogether comes up to around 500 million or what have you. And there was this expectation 25 years ago that this was going to sort of automatically turn into a world-beating entity, something that could stand on equal terms with, I mean, China wasn't even really that much of a factor back then, but stand on equal terms with the United States and compete with the United States and China going forward. But some of the basics never really got put together. I think one of the most important of those basics was just fiscal unity, beginning to see the place as a unit rather than 27 odd countries with their own budgets, their own approaches. We've seen some real hope on this topic over the past week or so. Europe does tend to make its biggest moves forward during a crisis. The last time we were this hopeful about growing European unity, growing sort of recognition that the richer countries in Europe have to take some responsibility and use their resources to snap Europe out of a funk. The last time we really saw this was during COVID, and that was also very exciting when some of the richer countries admitted they might have to do more to bail out other countries. What we're seeing now is a really momentous shift in the policies of Germany itself. Germany, for the entirety of the existence of the European Union, has been all about extreme fiscal rectitude, all about balanced budgets, all about really draconian rules around how much money it could spend, which was, I'm not saying they need to spend as much money as the United States did, but the United States sort of spent its way out of the recession after the 2008 financial crisis under Donald Trump, and Europe has never done that. It seems now, in response to some of Trump's national security stuff, like Europe is actually willing to do that. Specifically, Germany is willing to do that. Now, I think that it's kind of like a monkey's paw thing. I've wanted Europe to spend more money for a quarter century now. The absolute worst way to spend that new money would be on defense spending. The European military-industrial complex is not as corrupt and nasty as the US version, but certainly a very expensive weapon system is a way to funnel money exclusively to rich friends of the government and a few engineers. This is not like the 1950s where you put money into defense and you have assembly lines and everybody gets richer. So it's not exactly the kind of spending that I would want, but crucially, vitally, Germany isn't just doing this for defense spending. They are sort of releasing the debt brake on local governments across Germany. They are putting together large infrastructure funds, which are really useful and things that could really help. And if Germany does this, if Germany sort of essentially lets the money printer rip or what have you, this will have positive, incredibly positive knock-on effects for the rest of the continent. There was also additionally Ursula von der Leyen, a sort of EU figure, was talking about $800 billion euros for defense. But, you know, it now seems like that's shrinking down to 150. And now very few people are sort of taking this, really taking that aspect of it as seriously as they were 2 weeks ago. But the Germany thing is big. The Germany thing is a huge shift. It's a huge, potentially positive shift. And what I was thinking was that actually Europe is beginning to put together like one part of the solution to its problems of stagnation. But there's another part. 25 years ago, Europe had companies that competed with the United States. Obviously it wouldn't have as many of those companies, but in the largest industries, the biggest corporations, Europe could go toe-to-toe in a small way with the United States on that. That's not something that exists anymore. So I kind of want to just go back to an idea I put in another video making a different argument about 5 years ago, and I wanted to present this again because I think that very simply, Europe could take some really basic actions, just do something that China has already done, and potentially have companies as big as the United States again. And to do that, what better time is there to do that than when things have consolidated to the degree that Germany is actually willing to spend money again. So it might be, this 5-year-old video might be presenting an idea whose time has come.
You won't hear about it much on cable news, but among those of us who read books, it's pretty obvious that the world functions under a US-led system. The United States was able to set up this system, and it survives because it provides benefits and the illusion of equality to countries all over the world. But since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been acting in ways that puts this system into jeopardy. Remember sovereignty, the idea that every country has the right to mind its own business? The US treats that idea like toilet paper now, not just for places like Iraq, Syria, and Libya, but for any country in the world that tries to maintain its own trade policy with a growing number of countries. Remember security? Over the past decade, the European Union was almost destroyed twice. First by a US financial crisis, then by US policies in the Middle East that created a flood of refugees. What has saved US leadership so far is actually the Chinese Communist Party. Sure, the US looks like more and more of a demented basket case, but what the Chinese have going still looks a lot scarier. They're not offering anybody sovereignty or security either. The thing is, over the past decade or so, a troubling new aspect of US hegemony has developed, and the Chinese may really have the antidote to it. Supposedly, free trade has been the cornerstone of U.S. leadership since the 1940s. The U.S. usually had the biggest companies, but other countries always had serious competitors that they controlled themselves. This held true all the way down to the first decade of this century, when banks ruled the world. The European and Asian megabanks were sometimes even bigger than the U.S. versions. This balance, or at least appearance of balance, has now disappeared entirely. The most important and valuable companies in the world are all technology companies, and our allies don't seem to have any. Oh wait, maybe, I guess, all of Europe can congratulate itself on having Spotify? Woohoo! This problem has been exacerbated by coronavirus, which is commonly understood to have done a decade's worth of pushing business online in just a few months' time. It's tempting to tell US allies that this is just how capitalism works and they should be more competitive, but that's going to get real old real fast. In a world where just 4 US companies are more valuable than the entire Japanese stock market, it's not going to take long for people to get sick of US-led capitalism. And China has already shown that they have an alternative that works. They have the world's only large-scale, non-American tech companies.
5 years later, this problem hasn't gone away. It's in fact gotten massively larger. There's now, we've added NVIDIA and Tesla to the 5 tech companies that were already dominating the world economy, or at least world capital markets, and their size is even larger. It's even more a dominating part of the investment business climates of the entire world. And Europe is obviously falling even further behind. It's now becoming an acknowledged issue that Europe is not only allowing its 500 million people to be sort of farmed by these malicious tech companies, it's also funding them. Large European pension funds and certainly European elites have not resisted the stampede into these very few U.S. tech companies that have sent their stock prices even further into the stratosphere. It's this very weird situation where the European commitment to the free market has led to this sort of parasitical or like vampiric relationship of these tech companies to Europe. Europe gets some benefits. Ireland gets a lot of benefits, but it does not make up for the amount of money that tech companies make off of Europe, both through their monetization of the European audiences and also the European investors pouring more and more money into these companies. Now, obviously, Europe is a different, less authoritarian place than China, and the prospect of a firewall is not quite as appealing because of the political traditions that Europe has. But Europe can choose to do these things voluntarily. Also, Europe has less of a commitment to free speech than the United States does, which is, I think, in most cases problematic, but here could actually allow Europe to do some basic things to protect itself, to correct this extraordinary situation that's only getting worse and worse, where they don't have any companies that can compete with US and Chinese giants. Obviously, Europe has oil companies and banks and car companies and other industrial behemoths that are important. But at this point, I mean, these are the competitions of another century. Europe obviously needs to have large tech companies of its own. This has been highlighted recently. Mario Draghi, perhaps the most respected politician in Europe. I think he's credited with sort of saving the EU during the sovereign debt crisis about a decade back. In October of 2024, published a 400-page report on restoring European competitiveness. Everybody saw this as a great, this is another moment where we have to pay attention. We have to look and see just how terrible the situation we are in. And it was good. It was a recognition of the stagnation of Europe and the importance of doing something to change it. But in this 400-page document, which I'll admit I've not read more than a couple pages of, there's very little presented that suggests an actual way forward. Europe needs to spend more money. Yes, of course. Europe needs to figure out how to do innovation better. And it's like, yeah, but how? The thing is that these incredibly wealthy, incredibly overvalued companies in the United States become hubs of monopolization, but they do get to set the agenda on tech. They do get to suck up all the talent on tech. You can make a pretty strong argument that actually the Chinese companies are doing a better job of handling issues like AI and tech innovation at this point, but I don't want to get into that in this video. But there's no question that these massive, massive US companies are able to create, or at least profit off of, a ecosystem of innovation that they create with all their money and market dominance. How is Europe going to do any of the innovative changes that Mario Draghi would like them to do if they don't have these companies? Well, I would submit that with some very basic, probably not even that limiting changes to European regulation, they could very quickly develop these countries of their own. They should simply say that they could say you're not allowed to do business with these companies anymore. You are forced to go to European alternatives to the US. I think Europeans could totally do that, but it's not something that they have to do. It doesn't have to be that draconian. I think it's a fairly well-acknowledged thing that a lot of Europeans are pissed off or even frightened by Donald Trump and Elon Musk at this moment, certainly feeling betrayed by them. That's kind of a feeling that Donald Trump has worked to create and will work harder to create. This is a moment where it's very easy for a real European alternative to the US tech giants to start up and to pick up a ton of eager, excited people to have a European alternative, to stop giving all this money to US companies. We have a really good example here when Elon Musk took over Twitter. Meta, one of Facebook, one of his rivals, was able to quickly capitalize on how angry everybody was at Elon Musk and his new Twitter policies. They put out a product called Threads. It's a bit moribund now, but they picked up 100 million new subscribers in I think a matter of weeks. It was the fastest growing technology product in human history. Europe could easily do that off of Donald Trump. And unlike Threads, which was intended to be sort of like a half-assed, probably just sort of catering to one section of U.S. politics' affections. There's nothing new or innovative there. There's nothing useful that you can do on Threads. It's just sort of a Twitter clone. Nobody really knows what to do with it. They're trying to use it to push people to Instagram. Europe could do its own version of, I mean, does Dailymotion still exist? There's YouTube. Their own version of, it'd actually be very easy for any one of a number of European smaller tech companies to start with a Twitter alternative and then move on to a Facebook alternative and an Instagram alternative and a WhatsApp alternative. It's a very easy path that I'm just not seeing, even without government influence. I think the scope exists right now for a European tech company to become a large European tech company. And then you don't have to even make it legislated. You can just make it part of your advertising, which I'm sure US tech companies would claim as some sort of violation. But I mean, the United States, it seems like every article of clothing I own sort of says Buy American on it or something. Why not just Internet European? Doing that would, I believe, give Europe a very viable, very useful path forward.
When we think of China's great internet firewall, we usually think of oppression and censorship. But it has also meant that China can hold on to independent internet companies. Countries across Europe and Asia that remember independent economic life are going to find that prospect more and more attractive. If you doubt that this instinct for freedom exists, I suggest you read more about the EU's long-running battles against US technology companies like Google and Microsoft. A smarter Chinese government would rebrand the technology behind its Great Firewall as an instrument of national freedom and independence. It may seem absurd, but in the context of US software companies eating all of international commerce, that's kind of what the Great Firewall is. A smarter China could completely rebrand the battle over Huawei 5G technology as a fight against US imperialism. Over the next decade or so, I think U.S. hegemony is vastly more vulnerable here than it is in the South China Sea. If U.S. policymakers and business people were smart, we would be thinking through this vulnerability and coming up with solutions that don't make us look even more like whiny imperialists. So far, the United States hasn't really needed to up its game.
In the 5 years since I made that video, I have come to see the prospect of U.S. tech companies losing out to other players in the world as less of a threat and honestly more of an opportunity, like for the United States, especially with the inauguration of Donald Trump. The few oligarchs in control of these companies, it's an understandable Freudian slip at this point, have proven themselves to be pretty craven acolytes of the worst kinds of power, Donald Trump specifically. But even beyond that, the size of these companies has gotten to a point where this is by far the largest threat to the United States, and I would say the world in general. The power, the degree to which every baby boomer retirement is reliant on these companies, the extent to which these companies are now absorbing more and more and more of the US economy. I think we're just a few years from the tech companies essentially completely eating at least the U.S. automotive industry. So really, I think for Europe to do this, to institute some kind of firewall between European and U.S. internet companies would be not just great for Europe, it would be great for the United States, and it would be great for the world in general. I think we're beginning to get a sense of how impressive or how useful the competition between U.S. and Chinese tech companies is, that competition between these companies in fields like AI, electronic vehicles, this, that, and the other thing. It'd be very important. It would be very useful for the world in general if there was also European versions of these companies to compete with. And I think really amusingly, the problem is not, as Mario Draghi might have suggested, I didn't read his report, that the Europe isn't free market enough. It's that it has in fact been too free market. On the altar of being able to sell a couple more BMWs or some pharma products to the United States without restriction, it has allowed these tech companies that are now becoming quasi-governments, or in Elon Musk's case, more than governments, allowing these companies completely free range on Europe's 400 to 500 million people. They've sort of free marketed themselves out of an entire industrial sector, large scale consumer technology, and I think this actually is like. This is obviously a unproduced sort of slapped together video, but I think it really is a way to fix Europe and make the world a better place and cut down these U.S. tech companies that are, I believe, the largest threat at this point to the United States political system. I think this is like win-win for everybody. So yeah, like bring on the Euro Google. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for the Euro Google. Thanks.